there completely sucks. We are the best. So don't
I,
even
I would
bother.
I would agree with that. I think that's true.
I'm just joking. There's great content out there, but
There is.
not quite as great as ours.
But
It
I'm
is
confused. What day and time is it?
it is Saturday, November 2nd at exactly 9 a.m. Danny killed it this morning with
We were
the
on the nose.
9 a.m.
All
on the
right.
dot.
All right.
I hope
You know,
everyone's
I did
having a
want to
good
mention
Saturday. Go ahead. You
before we
go
get
mention.
started, before we get started,
We
if
kind of
you
started,
watch,
but
okay, so while moments after we start,
okay.
if
You
if
can't
you
do it before
watch
anyway. We
these,
wouldn't be live. Go ahead. Sorry.
okay, so if you join us live on Facebook, you should know that we also have a YouTube channel where not only do we post these, but we also post a whole bunch of informational computer content as well on programming. And if you are listening to our podcast or watching us on YouTube, you should also know that on Facebook we have an absolutely awesome group where we interact regularly with tons of people posting
Yeah.
lots of content called Code Noobs Programming for Career Changers, and you can join that group for
Yeah,
free.
I want to say something about that because I've noticed that there's a lot of people who have been joining our Facebook group and who've been watching our content on YouTube. And number one, I just want to say thank you because that's amazing. But
And
I
welcome.
know,
Thanks, David.
yeah, but I know that a lot of people are enjoying our content so much because there's really not anything like this on YouTube. There's a ton of coding tutorials and there's a ton of how code works kind of stuff, but there's very few people actually just talking code, right? And so I would imagine that if you are watching this and you are enjoying this episode like the other ones, that you probably want a community of people who are interested in coding, right? And sharing their ideas, who are sort of in the same spot as you as like a new aspiring developer. And that's what our Facebook group is. Okay. So if you are interested, just go over to facebook.com/groups/code noobs, all one word, and join up, right? There's about 1,200 people in there right now, and it's growing every day.
Yep. That's right.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
code noobs.
Yeah. I remember joining a bunch of programming groups when I wanted to kind of get involved in programming on Facebook. And it was like
Yep.
there's basically like two types of programming groups. So there's one that's like I want learn programming or I
Yeah.
have
teach
programming work.
teach me
Teach me,
program.
please.
who
Yeah, PLZ.
will teach me
So
Python?
so that's like one of the type of programming groups out there. The other group it just posts straight porn. Like that's
Yeah.
it. You
Just
know?
porn.
Well,
So it's,
they found a chink in the armor of Facebook. They
yep.
call the group something else, and then
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll
but
yeah,
say that
this
too.
is
I
the
mean, a lot of
third
people
group.
ask us,
We invented something new, a programming group
yeah.
where we actually
eh,
discuss coding
well,
and
you
you
know
know,
what?
and yeah, learn.
a lot of
People,
people ask that because they're like, how is your group like not just full of porn? And it's because we curate our group. We don't just let everybody in, and then we actually highly monitor it so that anybody who does post that is gone like day one.
They get the
So
ban hammer.
yeah, the ban hammer,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So
No, you need to
yeah,
do that though. You gotta get rid of those people, otherwise it turns into a mess, you know? But I think people don't realize how important the community is though, because it really does help. Like just having a place
yeah,
where you can ask actually questions and get honest answers and not like garbage or, get directed to porn or something like that, and where you can actually interact with people at the same level or who are willing to talk to you and not treat you like you're, an idiot just because you don't understand some basic concept, even though everybody starts out there. Like,
yeah. I mean, we're all idiots here, right? Like we're all code noobs.
Everybody
So
everybody's learning. You know, there,
no, I
it's
know.
it's crazy because
perpetually.
like the more you learn, the more you feel like you don't know anything at all.
Yeah,
So
Wait,
yeah.
I was thinking about this the other day. Imagine if you started like coding in the 90s, you would have had to learn so much. I mean, it's continuous. We're going to have to learn so much, and we still learn a ton because it's always going to change. There's never going to be a point where it stops changing and there's not new things coming out.
yeah,
There's not new tools, updates. I mean, like we talked about the Next.js update, and there's a ton of new stuff in that you need
yeah,
to learn, right?
yeah.
To use.
Totally. I just want to say good morning to everybody because we're getting all these good mornings in the comments. So good morning, David. Good morning, Brandy. I think there were a few others, but I can't see them anymore. But good morning, everybody. How are
Hmm.
you
Too
guys
lazy to
doing this morning?
scroll.
Well, let
Yeah.
me, I guess, get into the topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, Amanda said, thank you for enforcing the ban hammer. We're all about the ban hammer. Like
Yeah.
Mhm.
we don't
Like
take it lightly because we realize
It's
that
cool
there's
because
so
you can
much
ban
junk
them
out
and
there.
their future accounts too.
which is
Yeah.
nice. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
pretty cool. And this is one of the things too that I've seen is, I get a lot of questions of people are like, why don't you have a Discord group? And the reason why is exactly that, because you can't really monitor a Discord group as much as you want, and it just turns into junk eventually. So we're really, I guess you'd say we're against Discord, but we do have a very, very amazing group inside the Web Dev Incubator. We have a private Telegram group. So, that's only for people who are paying, right? Because and we know that they're highly committed and they're not just going to share junk in there. But that's a more open group if you guys, want access to a community that's like, you can just chat back and forth. That's what that's for. So, anyway, with that, today's topic is all about APIs, or as I like to call them, appies.
Okay.
happens.
I was wondering how
They're-
to pronounce it.
Yeah. No, they're really called APIs, which stands for anybody.
Application
Bueller?
programming interface.
There you go.
There you go.
Application programming interface. So what is an API? Anybody?
Well, if you don't know, we just said what the name is, what it means, what the acronym
Yeah.
means. It should explain
Well,
everything.
wouldn't it then be an interface where you could interface with an application, a program?
So I think it's actually a lot of people
Program.
call it application programming interface, and sometimes it goes by like application program interface. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, go ahead, Danny.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, like, I think like what you do need to realize about APIs though is that you do need to learn how to use them because they are what make web apps possible.
Yeah.
They allow all these different, really, if you think about it, it's kind of amazing because they allow all these different, in different languages, different setups, software and programs talk to each other, and that
Yeah.
enables us to just add tons of stuff to projects that we would never be able to do on our own because it would take forever. Like I was just thinking about the
Yeah.
other day because I'm using the Stripe API to connect payments in a project I'm working on. And if you had to set that up yourself, well, first of all, I don't know how you would manage payments by yourself without connecting to you have to connect to Visa and MasterCard and all these companies. You have to facilitate the payments. You have to have security, all that stuff. That would be a whole thing. That's a whole project in and of itself, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
so this enables you to just kind of hook into that and use it.
Not to
And-
mention, there's so much liability in
Oh,
managing
God,
and
yeah.
storing people's credit cards. I mean, there's actually like certifications you have to legally do that in a lot of places. So, but let's get back to the API. So I want to give everybody sort of a good understanding of what APIs mean, because I think a lot of times we talk about them in sort of an abstract way of like, they just connect this to that. And so I want to give like a deep understanding to some degree, at least, so that everybody sort of has a good conceptual understanding. So I think before we do that, we have to explain what it means to have a front end of an application and a back end of an application, right? And how actually data moves around the internet. So if you don't already know this, it's totally fine. It's, one of the core concepts that you have to learn as a web developer when you're getting started. And that is that when somebody goes to a website and types in a URL, what exactly happens next, right? Because that actually helps you understand how APIs actually work. So do you guys want to like explain a little bit of that, or would you like me to just go directly
No.
into it?
Well,
I don't want to
so the
say anything.
URL will be resolved into an IP address.
Yep. So we as humans, it's very hard for us to remember complex numbers, I think past 9 or something
Well,
like
they've
that.
gotten pretty long too with the new
Yeah.
IPv6 and stuff. They're really long strings of numbers, colons, dashes, and stuff.
Yeah. So instead of remembering all these crazy numbers that computers need to know, we just remember, a URL like facebook.com, right? And we type that into a browser, and that gets sent out to a DNS server, which returns an IP address, right? It turns that into an IP address. And then that's actually where there's a bunch of files stored on some server somewhere out there on the internet, right? Some in the cloud, you
Well,
could
that's the
call it.
crazy part. It could be a server, it could be a content delivery thing, which is just server.
Yeah.
But there's all these places that are going to process your call, right? What you need.
So we're saying, hey, give us the files, the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript file associated with this website. And there's, through HTTP, which is a transfer protocol, basically a way of communicating online, we're going to make a request to a server, which is just really somebody else's computer on the internet, right? And that server is going to respond with either, sure, here's the files, or some sort of error, right?
Mhm.
And that error could be associated with, I don't have those files, the server's not working, you're not authorized to see those files, whatever it is, right? And
You
then
may
those
have gotten
files,
those before. They're, if everything's okay, you get a 200, but if it's not okay,
right?
you might get a 404 error. You get a
Yes.
302 redirect if it's going somewhere else. If
You get
there's
500
a
for server
500 error
error.
for server, yeah.
Yeah,
So you may
exactly.
have
So,
seen those before getting returned
and
to
you
you.
may not really have understood what those mean, but those different 100 levels, like 200, 300, 400, 500, are actually very important. They tell you a lot about what's going on. Go ahead,
Yeah, and
Danny.
I just gonna say, like, it's important to understand too, our browsers are super powerful software nowadays. Like, they are
Yes.
really powerful. And the other thing to keep in mind too is this separation between client and server is really important, or front end and back end, because it also allows you to have, sophisticated logic and stuff that the client can't interact with directly. Right.
Yes.
So like, and that's important for security reasons, for all sorts of reasons, actually. I mean, really, because you don't want them to have direct access to like your database to write things, or you don't want them to see maybe how you're doing certain things so that, that information is not exposed to everyone, right? Like your keys or tokens, things like that.
Yeah.
What Danny just said is a really, really important concept for security. So if you guys are interested in cybersecurity, understanding that anything on the client side can be manipulated.
In other words,
So
the browser side, right? You can open
yeah,
up the
exactly. So
inspector, the dev tools, and you can
Yeah, a good
manipulate
way to
anything
learn
on the
that, yeah, is
page.
open up DevTools. You can go right in the console and you can change your browser page directly. And that's not obviously doing anything significant or dangerous, but it just shows you that you can interact with it that way. And then you can
Yeah.
do a far more dangerous things, obviously.
yeah, and you can use there are free proxies. Things like Burp Suite is one that's used by a lot of people in cybersecurity. And this is something that sits between the client and the server. And so it can change requests even if
Yeah.
you don't think they would normally be able to be changed. So,
Yeah.
but what Danny said there is it's important to note that anything on the client side should be considered inherently insecure as opposed to on the server side.
Yeah. So we use these terms client and server a lot. And so when we say that, what we really mean is the client side is everything that's happening in the browser, right? On your personal computer. And then the server side is everything that's happening on somebody else's computer somewhere else. And usually that means in a data center that's owned by AWS, Google, or Microsoft, right? You can host your own servers, right? That is possible. And a lot of companies do that. Most developers nowadays use cloud hosting because it's more efficient, right? It can be your website can be hosted all over the world. It's
It's
faster and
scalable.
it's scalable and
And it's
there's less
cheaper.
setup,
It's
right? I think
cheaper too,
that's
yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
cheaper, right? I
Well,
think those are the two biggest things is it's cheaper and there's less setup and there's less maintenance, right? Like you don't have to if your server goes down, you don't have to go like turn it back on or reset it. Somebody at Amazon is doing that constantly.
yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know if you guys noticed, but when Nvidia stock skyrocketed this last year, part of the reason was that when they came out with those new graphics cards that had the AI in them, Facebook ordered 300,000 for their
Yeah.
data centers. I think Google ordered a couple 100,000. Like, I mean, you're talking about the amount of money required to maintain these centers to make them as fast as possible and competitive. If were managing your own server, you have to do those updates. Now, granted, you're not going to buy 300,000, but the point is, right, it's expensive. You need a team of people to manage it. It's a lot of work. And so
And
it's a
also
lot easier to do it this
redundancy.
way.
This is
Yeah.
something that you don't think about,
Yeah.
but Amazon has at all their locations, they have multiple different data centers just for redundancy. So if something goes down, it'll still be available, which is
Yeah.
pretty
Yeah.
crazy.
Which is awesome. So we were talking about like how this whole communication happens where website is served, and that actually is an API, like in the sense of the word, right
Yeah.
there. But then once you get that first page load on any website, then as a user, you have the opportunity to interact with that page, and that interaction can actually cause more API calls, right? And so to just sort of sum it up, the idea of an API is that all you're doing is providing some framework where the front end of an application, what the user sees, can interact with the back end. And so I want to sort of talk about this and open it up, because Danny touched upon this before, is why do we separate those? Why not just send the whole freaking website, the whole database, everything? Just send it all, man. Why not? Why would you guys say not to do that?
Well, lots of reasons. Security, number one. Two, just the
Yeah.
size would be ridiculous. I mean,
Yeah.
we want speed is important, right? We want these things when you go on, if you expect a website to open immediately, you expect it to load
In
quickly.
2024. In
Yeah,
1992, it
We
was
did
like
not.
wasn't
It
so
took
much.
6
forever.
hours.
Dude,
Yeah.
that was the best.
I remember
like,
watching pages load like this.
Yeah,
Especially if it has picture on
were
there. Oh
so
my
funny.
God.
You could watch the pictures slowly go.
Yeah, line by
Oh
line.
man,
Yeah.
yeah. But anyway, nowadays we expect it to be quick, right? And if
Well-
it's slow, you're going to lose business. And so
Yeah.
you want it to be also slim, as light as possible, which means only sending what you need when you need it.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Go ahead,
there's a
Randall.
really interesting exercise that anyone can do who's watching or listening right now, is just on whatever web browser you have, go to developer tools. So you can right click and click inspect, or I think it's like Command I or Windows
I think
I,
it's like
whatever.
Windows Command
like-
I, yeah.
Yeah, something like
Depends
that.
what you're on,
So
Windows or Mac.
if you go into developer tools and under the
I was trying to
network
say it's
tab,
F12 for Windows too. Sorry.
okay, yeah,
Okay,
click
so
the-
go to
click
the
the-
developer tools.
go to developer tools, and then there's a tab that says network. Click on the
Mhm.
network tab and then just browse through some websites. And
Yeah.
you'll see that thing is just like flying. A
Yeah.
lot of those are API calls that are going on, or different calls that are going on behind the scenes that you never actually see happening.
I was
Yeah.
also going to say too, if you guys have already dabbled in web development, even if you're noobs, you've already probably used APIs. There's tons
Yeah.
of APIs that if you're using the DOM, that's an API. If you're using, when
Yeah.
you access
They're
like
browser
events,
APIs.
Windows,
Yeah.
they're browser APIs. And so an API it's really just, think of them, I always thought of them as just their services that you can
Yeah.
connect to make, your life basically easier and connecting to other stuff that people have already created. They
Yeah.
always use that the restaurant metaphor is always a good one, or analogy
Yeah.
is a good one.
Well, I think about what you said before, where you were saying sort of like, there's all these different technologies out there that make up the internet and our computers, and right. And there's different languages. There's different ways
yeah.
to configure these languages. And so what you can think of an API as is it's a communication tool, like a telephone basically, right? But it has an interpreter built into it. So not necessarily like built into it like it's doing something, but the API is set up in a way where you have this structured way of communicating between two different languages or two different technologies, right? Maybe within the same language, but they know how to interact and send the data that they need back and forth in the right format, right?
And
so
that's
that's
what's cool though,
that's
because
the
that really
basic concept of what's going on.
that made it possible for, the internet to be what it is now. And think about it. I doubt any of you guys install software in your computer anymore. And if you
Yeah.
do, it's probably a version of the browser web page that you're seeing that you're just installing. Like it's an app basically built from that, because everything is web-based now. There's no reason
Yeah.
to really make software specific to a certain operating system or anything. And that's what's so cool. Like these things have made it, they made it more ubiquitous and easy to connect because there's protocols built in.
Yeah. David Campbell said sort of like a switchboard. And yeah, I would agree. It's like, a switchboard, a way of communicating between two different services on the internet in a way where they understand each other. Now, I will say this too, because as a developer, I think we should dig a little bit deeper into, okay, I get the main concept, but how do I do that? How does that happen in code? Right? Because now, okay,
They're all
you understand.
different.
Yeah, exactly. So there
That
let's
is
just
funny.
start with this is there's different types of APIs. There's like RESTful APIs, there's like GraphQL APIs. There's different ways of communicating, but by far the most common is RESTful APIs. It's what you're going to see. And all that means is that it's basically sitting out there waiting for communication. And we use these basic operations, right? So there's get, post, patch, and delete, right?
It's
and
just
so,
like actually interacting with a database, because most of them are
Yeah.
just databases anyway. So
Yeah.
it is basically very similar. If you understand any of database stuff, it's very similar to that.
yeah. And there are other sort of like interactions that you can have besides those four, but those are sort of what make them up. And you may have heard of this as CRUD as well. Create, read, update, delete. There's
Or
different
sometimes they're
ways.
called the verbs.
Yeah, the verbs. And so basically what those mean is get means I just am getting some data, right? Like that's all that it is. I'm just asking for some data. Post means I'm posting some data. I'm sending, like maybe I'm sending a message or commenting on a Facebook post or something like that.
You
That's a
want something
post.
stored somewhere, put to a database,
Yeah.
right? Done something with. Yeah.
Yep. Patch is I'm updating, like I'm changing some data that already exists there. And delete is what it sounds like. You're deleting some data, right? And so a typical API has access to at least one of those, right? Typically it's get is the most common because you're going to get, the data from a website. And then the other ones are usually access controlled, right? So are you authorized to update some file? Are you authorized to post something, right? Are you authorized to delete something? Those are important. We have to make sure that whoever is doing those things is actually allowed to do them, right? Because we want the admin to be able to delete files, but we don't want everybody to be able to delete files. That's very dangerous. So
And it's also important to know too, whenever you're working with APIs, you're going to be doing asynchronous, right, programming, because
Very
you're going to
important.
be making, think of it, it's a request response, right? You're making a request to another service, and so you have to wait for that response. And so you need asynchronous programming because you don't want everything to stop.
Yeah.
So, you'll make some requests, you'll wait, it'll reply with either successful things, so the thing you want, or errors, right? And then you move on from there. But it's
Yeah.
important to understand that as well. It's all asynchronous so that whatever you're doing is still going to operate for the user on
I think
their end.
that's a really good point for anybody who's new because the internet is so fast now. It's not dial up anymore that when we access a website, it feels almost instantaneous for us.
We get mad
Uh,
when we have to wait for like a second.
Yeah, but the reality is there is a delay there. Even if it's like a few milliseconds, there is a delay. And so I don't know if you've realized this yet in your sort of coding career, but computers work really fast as well. And so if you're going line by line down a file of code and you get to a point where it takes a millisecond to get a reply, you're already down 10 more lines of code, right? Or more. And so we have to use certain keywords or certain coding techniques to make sure that our code waits for a reply from API. So a lot of times, like in JavaScript, you'll see async await, or you'll see, stringing like dot then, things like that.
Or use of promises, things like that.
Promises, yeah.
On a side note, and this is an interesting example, if you guys ever look up how the stock exchange handles the computer trading, they actually have a thing set up where they all have to have the same length data connection to the
Yes.
actual main thing so that it's fair. Because
Yep.
basically, if you had like a quarter of an inch shorter cable, you'd have
an
a
advantage.
lead over everybody else. Yeah, and it's really
Yeah.
interesting because it is so fast. And so then it becomes about how you design the software and the algorithms to make those interactions, right? That's where the
Yeah.
speed comes in. Yeah.
Yeah, like they all the like hedge funds or whoever's trading stock basically has the exact same delay in their requests for
Yeah, in
information.
their hardware. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is really cool because we're talking about, milliseconds at this
And those
point.
are like
But
those
that
ones where they're doing like the
changes
penny.
markets.
Yeah, like where
Yeah.
they're making millions on penny trades because it's all computer-based stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about, how these two things are set up because we're talking about the front end and then the back end and how these two things are set up in terms of code a little bit. Okay. We're not going to actually like get into code today. We're not going to show
But if
code,
you do want to get into coding with an API, there is an excellent
Yeah.
There is.
walkthrough in the web dev Kickstarter whole project where
Yeah.
you can build a Pokemon Pokedex API.
Yeah, you can just go to codenoobs.io/courses and you'll see that that web dev Kickstarter, which is a little mini course that we created. And I say mini course, but it's actually like a full course.
It is a
And,
pretty
and
it's
if you're
pretty
one of
good,
those
solid
people
course.
who's like buy curious and you want to try before you buy, you could actually check out our YouTube channel. We have the first video of that code along in there,
Yeah.
so you can try out and start coding and see if it is something you'd be interested in doing.
Yeah. Yeah, David Campbell said, I've heard them called getters and setters. Those are similar. Getters and setters are a more generalized term for any function that will get some piece of data and then set some piece of data. You can think of them sort of as APIs, but they don't always necessarily go over the internet, right? Getters and setters can happen within your
Own program.
front end
Yeah.
application
Yeah,
if you
your
want.
stuff.
Like you can get and set. Like when we talk about React, we have hooks like the use state hook, and that is technically like a getter and a setter.
Yeah.
So yes, that is like almost there, but we stress that APIs, generally talk between a client and server. Now that can be abstracted away and say there's browser APIs too. So
Yeah.
it's one of these things in coding where there's like these terms that are used broadly and they don't have exact
Yeah.
definitions. It's just like, hey, do you get what I'm saying with this? So yeah.
I think too, the other important thing, just to throw out there real quick, because I know we're getting close to it, is like, don't be afraid of APIs at all. They're like
Yeah.
everything else. You've already used them actually anyway. When you're doing any kind of JavaScript, you probably use them already. And the important thing is when you're working with APIs is to look at documentation like everything else, because
Yeah.
they are different and you need to understand before, like if you're going to use, say, Stripe API or a Google Map API to add features to your project, you need to know, well, first of all, what can I do with it? What services do they offer? I mean,
Yeah.
that's a good place to start. How do they name their fields so that I can get the right information? This kind of stuff is an important starting place, is always documentation with them, because they are going to all be different in that respect. How you get there, that will be the same. Yeah.
Well, Danny,
Yeah.
that's an excellent point, looking at the documentation, because when hacking APIs, the first thing you want to do is look for documentation,
Yeah.
Yeah.
particularly if there's older versions of documentation, or if it's a private API that somehow has public documentation. Those are like huge red flags that allow you to find vulnerabilities, loopholes, things that you can mess around with, things that you shouldn't essentially know. But when you're on the developer side, having the documentation there is essential because they all work differently.
Yeah. And we've talked about this inside the incubator group before, and I think it's a good point to make is there's a really good book called Hacking APIs that I think all three of us have read at least a portion of. There you go.
Right here.
Boom.
Yeah,
It's a good book.
there it is. It's a great book, and it talks about why APIs are basically the weak point of all web applications. And so
There's
as a
also another
developer,
one.
there you go. Yeah,
This
Black
is a
Hat
newer one, Black
GraphQL.
Hat
Yeah.
GraphQL.
So that's a
Nice.
GraphQL API. But as a developer, it's sort of, our job, whether you're a front end or a back end developer, to understand APIs and how they work, at least somewhat in depth. Particularly if you're a back end developer, you really need to understand the security of APIs, because you're the one
Especially if
who's
you're
basically
building one too.
yeah,
Like,
like
yeah.
you're the one who's basically creating the security. But a front end developer as well, you need to understand. And I know David Campbell asked this question previously, and I'm going to get to answering his questions, but he asked like about what is a bearer token, right? So when we make API calls, we generally have to share, unless it's a purely open API, we will have to share some sort of authentication. And that could be an API key, that could be a bearer token, which is essentially an API key as well. It could be like a session token, things like that.
You can also, you can also have a bearer token on your end too, to also ensure that, when you make that response and it comes back, that you're associating it with the right user, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, you need a lot of information basically to verify that what you're getting is correct, that it's the right
Yeah.
service, all that.
And that's part of a RESTful API too, is that they are stateless, meaning the front end and the back end don't have to share some state. They don't have to share a session, right? Every API call is its own call. And it's done that way on purpose because, the internet is not perfect and sometimes packets get lost and things like that. So we need to be able to send a request for data without having some, continuous connection with the server. We just need to be able to send it and the server can send something back to us. And so I think that's super important to understand, especially if you're interested in back-end development, is you really do need to understand a lot of at least basic security, right? And understanding authentication, authorization, and how that works. So I want to
Actually, to your point too, with front
Yeah.
end too, like it's also about protecting those keys. You'll have an API key that's your way of accessing this API, and that's how you get billed. That
Yes.
needs to be protected. You don't want that exposed to the client. because then anyone can open up DevTools and see it, and then use
Exactly.
your API key and charge you, right?
Yeah. And so I want to just briefly talk about the code for a second, just on a very surface level. And then I want to answer David's other question, which is regarding that and how to store API keys and things like that. So number one is I just want to explain a little bit of what's going on behind the scenes and where you should start looking into if you're interested in these. So I would recommend, if you're working in web development and you're getting started, you start with JavaScript because that's essentially what websites are built on. There are other languages out there that you can write backend services in, and front end like Python. You can write a full web application in Python, but I really recommend if you're getting started to start with JavaScript because it just gives you
It's
the
the number
fundamental
one
knowledge.
too.
Yeah,
It is, yeah.
yeah, and you can write front end and back end code with it. So on the front end, we're making a call to what looks like a URL. It's really a URI, but we call that an endpoint, right? It's where we're actually making that request. And sometimes that request can just be just the URL, right? If it's an open GET request, you're just basically making it to that. If it's anything else, and if there's any authorization or authentication involved, there's usually other things involved with this, like headers, a body, right? And those things can tell you, okay, how are we transferring this data? Like, are we doing it in JSON? Is it in XML? Is there some other format that we're sending and receiving data? It can tell you the authentication. So like, who am I basically? Am I authorized to do this action? And then the body will typically contain some data. So like if you're posting something, if you're adding something to a database, you might want to add some, whatever that information is, and that would be in the body. Now, like Danny said, the documentation is always the place to go because this setup can be vastly different on different APIs. Some of them, the authentication can be written into the URL itself. Some of them, it's as a bearer token that's in a header, right? So you have to understand how this API is expecting to get a request.
I will say that real quick, the documentation is usually pretty good though. Most of them will give you examples too. And
Yes.
it's a good starting point to like follow those examples when you're writing
Yep.
your first calls, just to, verify that you're getting what you want and using console logs and stuff to make sure that you're getting.
Yeah.
And if you want to start messing around with them on your own, there's some free programs that you can use to do that. There's Postman, which you can use and just watch some tutorials on Postman. There's also that one built into VS Code.
Oh yeah.
Thunder client. Yeah.
Mhm.
There's right in VS Code, you can download an extension. It's called Thunder Client. It's a really good one. There's also another one I think called REST Client. And they're great. There's plenty of free APIs out there. In fact, there is a post if you dig through. There's a post in the group about different free APIs, like the Poke API, which we use in our course. But there's other ones too, like
You
we
can go
use
to rapidapi.com too, and they have
a
whole like
they have a
thousands
ton of
and
them.
thousands, and there's a bunch of free ones too.
Yeah, in the inside the web dev incubator, we also built a project called the Kittens app, and we used the cat API, which gives you like pictures of kittens. Right? There's a lot of good APIs out there that are free and open source.
The government has some good free ones too. NASA's is free. You can use that. There's like the weather one's free. So like, those are good starting points for practice because you don't have to pay anything and you can mess around.
There's even a Kanye REST API. You guys are interested in that? Gives you Kanye West quotes. But so I want to talk really briefly about the backend too, because that's important. So we talked about how to make the API call, and just to be clear, you use something like fetch or Axios to do that, right? And you can look up fetch, like JavaScript fetch. Axios is a third-party package. Fetch is built into JavaScript, like front-end libraries. So you can use that without installing anything.
A lot of APIs also have their own NPM packages too that you can download that make it even easier to use. Yeah.
Yeah, even easier. So with the backend, basically, there's a ton of different ways to set up a backend service, like an API service. One of the more common ones for JavaScript is called Express. You've probably heard of that before. If you've heard of the MERN stack, the E in MERN stands for Express, right? And Express is basically a way to set up a server on any computer And basically what that means is a server is sitting there waiting for requests to certain API, say certain API endpoints, I should say, URLs, right? And so through that, there's, again, this is a very complex topic, and there's no way we could ever cover this in the 35 minutes that we're going right now. But we're just trying to give you starting points if you're interested in it. Express is a great way to learn how to build, the back end side of APIs. And you're basically setting up those endpoints. You're basically saying, hey, when somebody makes a request against this, what do I do? And typically, the way Express works is you set up a server, right, using by just installing the Express package and then setting up actually that server through a call. Like it's basically a function call. And then you have a function like app.get or whatever, and it's going to have the endpoint, like the slash something, right, at the end of a URL. And then there's
oftentimes
a
it'll be
function.
/API/v1/use,
Yeah.
whatever.
And it could be based on like what information you're trying to get. So it could be like /users/products, whatever. And then you're going to have a callback function that basically does something, right? So it might check for authentication, and then it might interact with your database. So your database is on a backend server as well. So it might get some information from the database. It might make like an SQL call or something like that. And then it's going to return that back to the user. And it might also return different things based on that authentication token or what kind of requests you're making. So yeah, Danny threw in the comments some links to Express.js. That's a great place to start.
And
If you're
NDN, the
interested.
Mozilla Web Docs, has actually
Yes.
a good little overview and little like tutorial on Express using it. So it's basic setup, how to use it. So that's a good place to start too for messing around, because you can build your own actually
Yeah.
as well.
And really to wrap ourselves up, if anybody else has questions, we're happy to answer those. But I want to just answer David's questions because he did ask some questions beforehand. And if you are listening to this on YouTube or on our podcast, if you join the Facebook group, even if you can't watch these calls live, you can ask us questions beforehand. We always post what we're going to talk about, and you can just post questions on there inside the comments. So I'm going to read David's because I think he asked a good question, and I think this is important. So he said, first of all, he said, will you guys be discussing a bearer token? And we sort of described this. It's basically an authentication token, right? So that's sent with your API request to make sure that the server knows who you are and if you're authenticated to get this information. The second thing that he asked is, what's the best way to hide API keys, tokens, or other env variables when doing web development? Doesn't seem to be as straightforward in web pages as it is in Node.js, where I just throw the env variable in .env and config.js, JSON, whatever. So basically he's saying like, how do I hide API variables if I'm not using Node.js? And the answer is you don't, right? You absolutely don't, because anything that you're sending to the client has access to see. So if you're trying to hide API keys in some client-side code, right, in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it's getting sent there. So we never, ever want to make API calls that require a token directly in the client. Now, that's for like an API, like a third-party API service. Like, for example, if I'm calling like Stripe or something like that, if it's something that the client is authenticated, we're doing that through some auth service, and that API is going to change based on who the client is, right? So we're not actually, it's not hard coded into anything. It's more like a session token, right? And then any API calls that require basically you to pay money for, like any service, like I can give you an example of like OpenAI, right? You can use ChatGPT, right? You can make calls to ChatGPT through an API. However, every call that you make costs money, right? It's a very small amount, fractions of a penny, but over time, with enough calls, that turns into a lot of money. So you don't want your users on the front end to be able to make those calls directly. What you actually want to do is have them make a call to your backend services, like your server, and say, hey, I'd like to make this call. And then your server authenticates first and says, hey, are they authorized? Do they have they paid for this? And if they don't, it's just going to say, nope, sorry, you can't. And if they can, then your backend makes the call and you store those API keys, those, environmental variables on the back end. So they never get exposed to the user. They're always stored on the back end. And
Yeah,
so
it's
this
like
is one
using
of the,
cloud functions, things like that,
yeah,
to facilitate the calls to the API service that you're using so that you're
yeah,
never exposing keys to the user, basically. And
yeah.
it takes a lot of setup and practice, but you get there. It's not, it's
Yeah.
not
And
impossible. It just
you
takes
make a
time.
good point too, Danny, is like you don't need to actually use Express and set up your own server to do this necessarily.
No.
You can use what's called serverless functions, which are confusing because you
They're
don't need
server
a
fun.
server, but they actually are on a server.
Yeah.
You can use serverless functions, which are offered by like Firebase, AWS, Lambda functions, things like that. You can use those to do this, right? And you just store your environmental variables there. And then your users can call against APIs that are generated by those functions. So
Bryce
this,
asked too, could you use Docker in a .env file? I mean, I guess theoretically you could because Docker is a contained, but it would depend on how you set it up. I
yeah,
mean,
it
because
would
you'd
depend
still
on how
be,
you set it up because if the API key is being sent to the client or is hosted on the client side at any point,
it's going to be viewable.
then it's exposed and you just really have to be careful. I know Randall showed this in one of our web dev incubator videos, how I forget what you use. I think it was Burp Suite, maybe
Yeah,
how,
Burp Suite.
yeah, how basically he can put an application between between the browser and the server, right? Between the client and server, and any data that's being moved between you and the backend service, when that, like, even if it's, you can't see it with the GUI, like the graphical interface, the code is there. And so he can very easily pull out API keys like in a second. It's not like a complex thing. It's like you literally just like press a button and there it is. Your API key is shown. So I know I used to do this with a company that I worked for. They had a email validation service where it could be integrated into a form, and a lot of people integrated it incorrectly, and they would expose API keys. And so we would go out and find these companies and just call them and be like, hey, I hope you know that your API key is exposed right now. And anybody who sees this can make calls against your account and use your money. Right. And that's the dangerous part is it's yes, there's danger in like sharing sensitive data, but the really dangerous part for you as a developer is if you have exposed API keys, that means other people can basically take your API keys and make API calls on your behalf and just steal your money, right? Like
Yeah.
rack up bills for services. So
Or
you
get
just
you
want,
banned from using it. Like that's the other thing.
yeah,
Like if you're
exactly.
using, depending on what it is, you might have a limit. Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, is there anything else you guys want to add? I know we ran
No,
pretty
pretty
far over
I
today,
think.
but
Yeah.
Yeah, I did just
Yeah.
want to add one more thing. So mentioned this in the beginning, but it's worth mentioning again now. So you guys
Yeah.
who watch the videos here on Facebook, join us live. You should also know we do have these available on a podcast. Also on YouTube, we have a channel there where not only do we upload these videos, but we upload some other very awesome instructional content, like the first video in the Pokemon Pokedex code along. You can check that out there. And then for those of you who listen on the podcast or watch on YouTube, definitely don't miss out on this incredible free group that we have on YouTube where you can
On
ask
Facebook.
any
On
question.
Facebook.
Oh, excuse me. Yes, thank you. On Facebook.
I
Yeah.
know it's a lot of things.
Yeah. So don't miss out because you can ask questions that you have. You can interact with other people who are in the same spot learning kind of like you. Just search Code Noobs Programming for Career Changers or go to facebook.com/groups/code noobs and you will find us.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. If you are inside the Web Dev Incubator, we will see you in about 15 minutes. And of course, if you guys are just brand new to coding and you're looking for a community of people who can support you, who can help you build amazing projects, who have amazing, really great instructional content, and who are doing weekly calls every week live with other developers, that's us, right? We have this amazing program. It's called the Web Dev Incubator. It's for anybody who is either brand new to coding or just kind of lost in their career and on their journey of becoming a developer and need some support from actual live people, you don't want to just continue watching YouTube video after YouTube video and be in tutorial hell. If you feel like you're in tutorial hell and you need direction, this is the spot for you. We have great curriculum. We have a 24/7 Telegram group where you can ask
Or maybe
us.
you've done a boot camp and you still are not working as a web developer.
Yeah,
right.
and you just want like career
which
guidance.
happens a lot, but we help a lot of our students in that predicament start working.
Yeah.
Like I said, we have a Telegram group. You get 24/7 access to us. So anytime you have any question, you can ask us, as well as all the people in the community who are amazing, really smart people who are doing all sorts of cool stuff and have great experience as well. And then we have 2 calls throughout the week. We have a Tuesday call where we go through a code along. We either use that time to just code together as a group, or we actually build projects together. And then every Saturday, right after this call, we do a motivation accountability call where we talk about what we did this week, what we found exciting, anything that we learned, any successes, any challenges that we had. We just like keep each other accountable and keep each other progressing 1% every day so that we become better developers. So if you feel like you're stuck, you're stagnated, you need help, support, feel free to schedule an action call with us. You can actually just put API in the comments here and we'll reach out to you, or just ping us,
That works too.
on Facebook.
There's also the
and
pinned post on the Facebook
yes,
page.
there's a
that
pin
has
post.
the link for setting up an action call.
Exactly. And I'll throw it down in the comments as well. Just click that link. You can schedule an action call with us. It's 30 minutes. It's free mentoring, really is most of what it is.
Yeah.
And then we just tell you about the Web Dev Incubator and see if you're a good fit for it. And if you are, we can get you signed up. If not, no worries, no harm, no foul. So with that, thank you guys for tuning in on another Saturday morning. I know it's bright and early for some of you guys on the West Coast, and we appreciate you coming out every week to come hang out with us. If you are inside the Web Dev Incubator, we'll see you in about 13 minutes, I believe.
Later, guys.
Peace, guys.
Later.
Have a